Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conference, which is very much a joint effort and partnership in bringing you all here today. We've had a very nice collaborative experience with the Transnational Arab Research Institute, which is co-sponsoring today's event. Hani Faris will be welcoming you in a moment on behalf of Tari. But I would like to welcome all of you for taking time on a beautiful Friday to be with us. We all remember so well, almost 3 years ago, the moments of exuberance in late 2010 and particularly in early 2011 as demonstrators reclaimed political space and in many places and instances proclaimed a revolution. Well, revolutions are not so easily made. Those moments of exuberance have been replaced by moments of reality, and part of our task during today's program is to evaluate just what has happened, what the successes and failures have been, and to sort of understand the sort of underlying impediments to change and the points of progress where we've seen points of progress. So we'll have ample opportunity to talk about that together with our speakers and to hear, of course, most importantly, what our speakers have to say. We are videotaping the event. We put a lot of effort into organizing these events, and we have 100 people or so who can take advantage of the experience of being here. But I firmly believe in the importance of, if you will, sharing this with a broader audience. So after the videotapes have been edited and so on, to edit out background noise and all that sort of thing, after they go through what's called post-production, they'll be up on the web probably in a few weeks as streaming videos, and people will be able to watch them around the world. And my experience is that we'll have thousands of people who watch the event. So, so we are speaking to a broader audience than simply the people in this elegant venue. That brings up a small point, and that is, if you're asking a question from the floor, please wait to have a microphone, because that will capture your question for the video. You won't hear any amplification when you're asking your question. It's only feeding into the video recording system. I should say also on the plumbing issue, we do have a couple of bathrooms in this building. And there's one on this floor. There's a second one on the second floor, sort of above where we're standing right now. Actually, quite a nice bathroom. I reconned it this morning. And we have a couple of buildings adjacent to this building that have restroom facilities as well, if you find desire to take a short tour of 2 or 3 minutes. And staff here at the castle, I'm sure, will be able to direct you as necessary. We're going to try and stay on schedule. We have a lot going on today, and we're going to try and stay on schedule, and that means we're trying to ask the speakers to be disciplined in their own presentations, and we ask you also in your comments or questions to try and exercise a degree of, if you will, conciseness in your questioning and comments. Finally, I have to announce, unfortunately, we're missing 2 people today who were originally listed on the program. Elaine Hagopian was to be with us, but she's ill today. She was to be one of the chairs. In fact, she was going to originally chair this panel. Thankfully, Mujid Kazimi has stepped in. And also, Sara Roy, who was to be a speaker on this panel, unfortunately has a serious illness in the family, and she emailed me late last night to tell me she probably wouldn't be able to be with us today. If there's an improvement, she said she will try and join us later in the day. So we will be missing her from the first panel. Sara is based, as you know, in Boston and Cambridge, so if we don't see her today, we'll try and find another opportunity to bring her over to BU to give a talk for those of you who would like to hear what she has to say. She's an important scholar and a leading expert on the social and political conditions in the Palestinian communities of the occupied West Bank and Gaza. So without further ado, welcome. And I'd like to turn over the floor for a moment to Hani Faris. And Hani, there you are. And before I do, I want to not only highlight the cooperation of the Transnational Arab Research Institute, but also the Harvard Center for the Study of the Middle East, Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Bill Grunauer, the director, is with us today, for their financial contribution to the event, which helped me avoid some sleepless nights. So thank you, Bill.
On behalf of Trans-Arab Research Institute, TARI, an independent Arab-American think tank registered in Massachusetts, and in my capacity as president of TARI, I wish to thank you for joining us and tell you how pleasurable to see you all in this conference. I'd like to take this opportunity to express my deep appreciation and gratitude to Professor Richard Norton. This conference has been in the making for the last 6 months. I can assure you there were at least one communication between us every single day, if not more. You can't imagine the amount of work that has gone into organizing this conference. And to Richard, I really salute him and wish to thank him for all the effort that him and his center have put into this activity. Moreover, Victoria Poyet, all of you who are guests of this conference know her. She is a superb organizer and administrator, and I'm thankful to her. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, scholars of the Middle East failed to predict the coming of the Arab uprisings. As a matter of fact, most of them thought the possibility of changing Arab political orders was highly unlikely. They were proven wrong. Scholars of the Middle East have not fared any better since the outbreak of the uprisings. They cannot seem to agree on how to explain their causes, dynamics, accomplishments, prospects, and other matters. They cannot even agree on what to call them: spring, awakening, revolutions, renaissance, epidemic, or the other descriptions and designations given to the uprisings. Notwithstanding these differences, these uprisings share two common features that are not contestable. First, they all involved the participation of large segments of the population and formed a phenomena that touched all Arab countries without exception. They were the closest to what may be described, truly described, as people's movements, and they spanned the whole Arab region. Their mass-based nature was the clearest in Egypt, where the crowds that took to the streets of Egyptian cities in January 11 and June 13 counted in the tens of millions. So massive were they that they have been classified among the largest demonstrations of political protest in human history. Additionally, it was not only the Arab countries covered on your news, such as Tunis, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria, that were affected. Small, remote countries, as far as Mauritania, Djibouti, and Oman, and relatively large and regionally powerful countries, such as Algeria, Morocco, and Iraq, were also touched. The second attribute common to these uprisings had to do with the clear rejection by a good portion of the population of existing modes of governance, or the relationship between them and those in positions of political and economic power. They toppled several despots from their thrones. Essentially, they rejected authoritarian rule, which suffocated individual and public freedoms for more than 50 years, giving the region the lowest ranking on the freedom scale, lower than any other region in the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, which had the lowest ranking on the economic development scale. Based on these two observations, a set of corollaries follow. First, the clamor of Arab masses for freedom, dignity, and justice, and their unspeakable courage and sacrifice in pursuit of these goals put an end to an intellectually bankrupt Orientalist thesis called Arab exceptionalism. The whole world watched in awe what Arab masses that had broken the barriers of fear were capable of doing. Second, the uprisings were authentic and popular movements and could not have been locally, regionally, or internationally preconceived conspiracies. They began as spontaneous national eruptions, though they have not remained neither solely national nor Arab, as was the case with Libya and Syria today. Third, countries of the region are interdependent, and the public concerns and ambitions of their populations are not that dissimilar. The refusal of the old regimes to recognize this relationship of interdependence or the ambitions of citizens was to their peril. To Mubarak, Egypt was not Tunis. To Saleh, Yemen was not like Egypt. To Gaddafi, Libya was not like Tunis or Yemen. And to Assad, Syria was unlike any of them. There is now evidence the contagion effect has not dissipated yet, and the countries of the GCC, for example, may still experience what North African and Arab East countries have encountered. Fourth and finally, for all practical purposes, foreign interventions in Arab uprisings have had primarily negative effects. They distorted the initial popular impulse for reform. The case of Syria is the most pronounced, where a game of nations whose target is the control of the region is being played out. A commission investigating Syria, set up by the UN Human Rights Council, wrote in its report of February 16, 2013, February 18, foreign interventions have helped radicalize the conflict by empowering groups and even encouraged mainstream insurgents to join them. Regional and international actors hampered the prospects of a negotiated settlement owing to their divergent interests. The positions of key international actors remain the same. The future course of Arab uprisings is still being charted, and their outcome has not been decided. The extent to which the masses remain attached to their demands for freedom and dignity, the role the agents of change, namely the youth and women, will play, the success of the new leadership in reforming socio-political institutions, and the ability to stop foreign powers from meddling and inciting internal divisions and supplying tools of destruction to warring factions. All of these four will determine the Arab future. This is what the conference is called upon to consider. Thank you. I'd like to turn the chair to Professor Mujid Kazimi to start panel one.
Good morning to all of you. I feel a little bit out of my element today since, first of all, I am speaking to a group of experts and scholars on Middle Eastern concerns, and I'm a nuclear and mechanical engineer, and I don't usually engage in such discussions. But there is no question that what is happening in the Arab world is on our mind, and we follow the transformations from day to day with quite a bit of interest and intrigue. And we are hoping that this conference would enable us to have further insights into the developments that are happening today. We couldn't ask for a better group of speakers in this conference as a whole, and particularly in this first session, to reflect on what's going on in the various Arab parts. And you know, it is hard to decipher exactly what is an internal factor and what's an external factor. And there is a different way to look at the social, political, and economic dimensions for what the people want and what the external pressures that Hani alluded to are bringing to the fields. But all transformations historically have taken time to take hold, and I think the Arab world is going through such a transformation today where at the end we might reach better democratic and human conditions for society. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Haytham Manna. He's a well-known human rights advocate over the entire Arab world, and perhaps I should say over the entire world. He's born in Syria and educated as a physician in Syria and in France before he decided to also attack anthropology, and he got a doctorate in anthropology as well. He is a prolific writer on human rights. It is said that he's the author of over 40 books on the subject, and he's also a very, very active participant in actually advocating for human rights, not only in Syria but all over the Arab world. He founded and participated in several groups. What caught my eye was the Defense of Democratic Freedom in Syria, in which he was active between 1990 and 98. He was a spokesman for the Arab Commission on Human Rights from 98 to 2002. He was the president of the International Bureau of Humanitarian NGOs in Geneva in 2004, and so on and so on. If you go on the web, you will find a much longer description of his contributions. Today, he's going to speak about National Coordination Body for Democratic Change, a roadmap for a political solution in Syria. Dr. Manna. Can you speak?
In June 30, 2012, we had what is well known today as Geneva Communique, which is the child of an agreement between no Syrian. 16 parties. Between these parties, you have the European Union, the 5 members of the Security Council, and the most important regional implicated countries. 3 countries were absent: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. When I read the draft before the publication, I gave some notes about what happened. But I can say that this is the best text which we had the capacity to take from the international and regional forces directly implicated in the Syrian conflict. We must remember that at that time, already the Syrian question was internationalized and militarized. 3 days after, we took the initiative to accept Geneva Communique in the National Coordination Body for Democratic Change. And I wrote in The Guardian about why and what is the points which we ask for to give Geneva Communique the capacity to be a good text for Geneva II. After that, we took the initiative also for Roma with many political tendencies which accept Geneva Communique. And we were 17 militants and intellectuals in Roma with Sant'Egidio. And we tried to put a declaration which complete and give life to Geneva Communique, because the Syrian National Council, a representative for the Friends of Syrian People, of the Syrian people, refused Geneva Communique. And we went in the last 10 days of August to Roma, and we discussed a text well known as Roma Declaration. After that, there were an agreement between us and many governments and no governmental organizations in human rights and in civil society to organize a great conference on democracy and civil state in Syria. Unfortunately, the pressure of many foreign affairs ministers stopped this operation in December 2012 in Roma. And I took the initiative at that time to organize this conference in Geneva in the 29th, 30th of January 2013. And we tried to establish a roadmap for this political solution, taking in consideration Geneva Communique. And at that time, we decided together, more than 270 Syrian, 70 people of them hadn't the right to come to Europe because of the pressure also of French government and other governments. But they were with us by Skype. And we put some elements to discuss with all parties of the opposition after the birth of the Syrian coalition. The first phase, this phase will be based in the consensus on power sharing based on the Geneva Communique. During this phase, the current constitution, official constitution, will be suspended. And it will not be replaced by the old constitution of 15th. Because as a human rights activist, I cannot accept a constitution established before all the important and really, which give for human rights its full name and take it as a reference. Syria ratified many conventions after this time, and all of these elements were not in the old constitution. For that also we prepared a national charter as a supra-constitutional elements for the Second Republic. And we asked for a transitional government based on these fundamental supra-constitutional elements. This transitional government shall have full power, as the 9th point of Geneva Communiqué explain. And we must start the process of institutions building, because we think that, we said it in Arabic all the time, لا نريد ديمقراطية انتخابات، نريد ديمقراطية مؤسسات. انتخابات بيشتروا، في مين يشتري ويصنع. المال السياسي في العالم العربي اليوم أقوى للأسف من الإرادة الشعبية. For that, this element is very important to us.
Can you translate this, what you
Yes, we need in the Arab world institutional democracy, and not only to reduce the concept of democracy in the word elections, because elections today don't mean anything with political money. The tasks of the transitional government are to prepare the country politically and security-wise for the second phase, which sets out the fundamental individual and collective rights, start the process of institutions building, guarantees the 3 liberties of assembly, association, and political and civil organization, restructure the military and security institutions, and determines the nature of the relationship, the structure, and the function of the military and security on the national basis. We have in Syria what we call dogmatic army. We need a national army. You have your also doctrinal army, paramilitary army. You know. Then we must work to a draft for a national program of arms control. And in this point, we need really immediately a resolution from the Security Council against the presence of all no Syrian fighters in Syria, from which country they came and for which side they are now. All of these no fighters must go out. Then develop legislation what will allow parliamentary elections. And here there is a problem really in our discussions between a parliamentary system and semi-parliamentary system, because most of us are against a presidential system as a reaction after 40 years of dictatorship. But in the same time, we have bad example from the parliamentary system in our neighbors' countries. Develop legislation that will allow these elections and work for compensate and rehabilitate the victims of violence. Begin the process of rebuilding in accordance with the contingency plan and international and regional commitment to support Syria and the Syrian people. This was the first phase necessary to begin from the first days in the so-called Geneva II conference. The second phase, we think that we need to realize some tasks like drafting of a new constitution for the country, leading to a referendum, passing laws, legislation, and rules which establish a separation of powers, cooperating with the transitional government in the management of the affairs of the country according to the new constitution. And in this also we can mention prepare the country for parliamentary elections, bring security and safety to the country, and supervise the election in accordance with the new constitution. The text I can give you after. I will not take a lot of time for all these details. In the 2nd of February, I asked Switzerland Foreign Affairs to help us to make training for the Syrian opposition to be ready for Geneva II. And they were surprised, first of all, after they accepted the idea. Because I explained to them that most of names that you see and you heard about are not ready to negotiate. And they need really training. When I spoke with some members of the coalition, some friends, which we spent together 2 or 3 decennies, they said to me they will not accept. Because every one of these people consider himself as prime minister or president. I said, no problem. We can call this training of leaders. Like that, they can accept the idea. And after 3 months, after the 7th of Mayo, when really we began to work in Geneva II, UN and Switzerland accepted our project, and I'm so happy that before coming here, training was made for the coalition in Istanbul, and it will be made when I come back. It must be now, but I ask it to be late, to be with you here. In the 26th of this month for our national coordination body and the High Commission of Kurdish people together. We asked for training for all people together, all parties, and the coalition refused. For that, we said 2 trainings, why not? The problem now that we have a decision from all the parties, the Syrian well-known parties as political parties, I'm not speaking about military, to go to Geneva without conditions. But this is another question. But they accepted all after 1 year and 4 months. That's mean after 60,000 victims more. They accepted to go with the pressure of the three Khawaja, that's mean three master of ambassadors, Mr. Ford and Chevalier and Wilkes. They accepted to go. And I think that our duty now to prepare what I call Geneva 1.5 before Geneva 2. That's mean a mini conference to the Syrian opposition to go to Geneva with a very strong delegation representative of the majority of political forces inside and outside. And our duty is to establish a realistic program, common program, together to go in a pull position to Geneva. If not, we will go, as we say in foot, 2-0 for the regime. And we are here. We try now to prepare Geneva with the idea that if we go without any changing in field, Geneva will not be enough popular inside the country. I know that the majority of Syrians now, the real majority of Syrians now, like to find a solution with evil. تعبت الناس, أنهكت الناس. They went out from Dar'a with the slogan الموت ولا المذلة. Death is better than humiliation. Now we are living in humiliation and death. And we must stop this tragedy. And if we don't have the courage to stop it, and we continue with demagogic slogans, and we take in consideration the program of foreigners in the Syrian territory, there will not be one Syria tomorrow. And I think that all people who have a minimum of conscience and responsibility must take that in consideration. Thank you.
Given the fact that we don't have one of our speakers, we can divide the time available for questions and answers among the three remaining speakers. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, if there are any from the audience. Dr. Azam will start.
Haytham, you said the first item on your... you said the first item on you was suspend the Constitution, right?
Yes.
Is this working?
You won't be able to hear yourself, but they can hear you in the machine.
This is for recording only.
Yeah, okay. Who is going to suspend the Constitution? You, Hayat Tansiq, the Americans, the Russians, Bashar al-Assad?
All of us together in the conference.
All of us together? That sounds extremely utopian. You said that لا نريد ديمقراطية انتخابات. We don't want a democracy of elections. Who is the we? You are speaking in terms of the we. Who is that we? Who that doesn't want democracy of intikhabat, but wants a democracy of... and all in all, it seems to me your whole plan is very utopian if you don't give us an idea of about how is it going to be implemented. Who is to implement it?
Yes. If it's better there. I am not utopia. I am very pragmatic, and more pragmatic than many people. And I think that we are not in the strongest position military, but we didn't lost any popularity in the majority of the Syrian society. The real majority of the Syrian society is for democratic change, and the old regime is finished. It is not the question of Sbina and Al-Qusayr. This is a military question which can discuss with Al-Nusra or the Free Army, but nobody from the Syrian people put in his house a white slogan and said, we finish and we like to come back to the old regime. Nobody. The real majority, marginalized by the militarization, is still here. And when violence go back, we are really very strong. And when I say we are, I'm not speaking about the National Coordination Body, because in this conference, we had 17 political parties which are not members in the coalition. We can ask and realize when we have a realistic questions. For example, now we said we must put Bashar away. And when you ask Lavrov, put Bashar, you must put Bashar. No, I give a question, because you say to me that I am utopian. I give you who is unrealistic, not utopian, because they don't have a utopia. These people who ask, for example, something impossible for the moment, I think they have a problem. But when we ask, for example, before going to Geneva, to release, for example, 70% of prisoners, which are not political or military persons. In prisons in Syria now, we have 70% of people, 70%, which are not implicated. He is the neighbor of a military or a political responsible only, or he is from the same family. For example, if I ask Russian or American or to impose this condition, it is logic, and they must help us. If I ask them about something impossible to realize, it's another thing. If we ask for humanitarian help to any region in Syria today, and I'm not speaking only about Mu'azzamit Sham, which is very famous and well-known example. I'm speaking, for example, about 3 million of people in the region with Kurdish majority, which the government of Turkey don't have the possibility to receive anything. And the regime also close completely any help for these people. And the Iraqi Kurdish and Baghdad, the same time, shut the way of humanitarian help for these people, and nobody speak. Nobody speak about them, for example. These things we can ask to realize these humanitarian and human rights. It's not condition, it's rights, it's our rights. And we can ask all the participants before and through Geneva to realize from the first day these things. But when we have really no realistic program and slogan with populism, and we try to give an idea that we are more radical, the opposition of the interior is with only some slogans, and they don't open the way to the departure of Assad, etc. This will not be in the service of the political solution. The political solution can give us really a way of disarticulation of the power. Because this solidarity, this asabiyya in the power is one of the most important reasons for it is the militarization. Before militarization, it was not so strong. When we stop this process of augmentation of violence, I think many things can be realized.
We can take one more question, but we need to be somewhat briefer in the dialogue. Please. Microphone. Okay. There we are.
Just for the recording. Thank you very much.
I wonder if in this Geneva 1.5 meetings that you will have, the question of asking the foreign troops or the foreign elements to leave Syria, the diplomatic dimension of the problem will be given priority, or do you believe that that should come after achieving some measure of political consensus among the participants? And on that score, what is your own assessment of the likelihood of a UN Security Council support of that idea, passing a resolution asking the foreign troops to leave Syria?
The last part, I spoke with the 5 members, and all of them agree this principle of a resolution. The Russians said exactly, without determination, Nasra, Hezbollah, etc. If it is no Syrian fighters, we agree. The Chinese also, the French and American and British accept the principle. And I think that we prepared already the draft for this resolution. But I think that there is something very important. From the moment, from the beginning of Geneva conference, we must take in consideration that the classification of the parties in conflict will change. The new, there will be إعادة موضع, يعني repositionnement in English. Reposition. Because people who are with the political solution and people who are against. And when we say people who are with, that's mean if the Free Army or the direction of the Free Army is with, and the PYD with, they must fight together against extremists. And the same thing for the army. They must stop all operations against people who are implicated in Geneva. And this is, I think, will give us another classification. And after the beginning of Geneva, you will see many people who are now friends, enemies, and vice versa.
Okay, thank you very much. I know this topic deserves hours of discussion, and hopefully we'll have some few minutes at the end to return to this question. But we need to move on to try to stay to the schedule. Our next topic will be the situation in Egypt. The speaker is Dr. Hamzawy. He's a noted political scientist. a professor of political science at University of Cairo and of public policy at the American University of Cairo. He's also a writer with frequent articles that appear in Al-Shuruq, an independent newspaper there, and several books, the latest of which is Getting to Pluralism, Political Actors in the Arab World. His topic today is Democracy in Egypt, Can We Still Hope?
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Kazimi, chair of the panel, Professor Norton, Boston University, Mr. Faris, Terry, thank you very much for the invitation. In the time devoted to me, I'm going to give you a snapshot of the current situation in Egypt. The snapshot which I'm going to share is going to be an academic snapshot, so I will leave aside my current role in Egyptian politics. Some of you may know that I was elected to parliament in 2011, served in the First People's Assembly, which was later on dissolved by court ruling. And some of you may know that I did serve on the National Council on Human Rights, as well as in the National Salvation Front, which was one, if not the major opposition front to Dr. Mohamed Morsi after he was elected president in 2012. And some may know that I'm considered, as of now, a liberal outcast because I spoke against military interference in Egyptian politics, and I continue to do so. I continue to draw a clear distinction between June 30th, the day on which, for different reasons, many Egyptians took out to the street to put forward what I considered a democratic demand, to call for early presidential elections. But Egyptians called for early presidential elections, did not call for an army interference in Egyptian politics. So I continue to draw a distinction line between June 30th, which I supported, and July 3rd, the day on which the army interfered in Egyptian politics again. And here we are standing in a situation quite different from the dynamics which we had right after February 11, 2011. We are standing in a situation which I would like to describe as a process of backsliding on a democratic transition, which began in 2011. So my definition of the current Egyptian reality, away from the war on terminology, which we are still very much fighting in Egypt. What was it exactly on June 30th? What was it exactly on July 3rd? And some of you will know that I have defined my position clearly on the two fronts, away from the war on terminology, away from political views and perceptions, and from an academic perspective. What we are witnessing in Egypt as of now is a process of backsliding on an initial democratic transition that began in the year of 2011. To approach the democratic backsliding which is taking place, I would like to highlight 5 key issues, which are, to me, to an extent, structuring realities of Egyptian politics and social dynamics, to an extent as well, an explanation for why Egypt is backsliding on democratic transition. The first factor which I would like to outline is the unchanged dominance of the military security complex in Egyptian politics, in the Egyptian political space, unchanged in the two years and a half in which we attempted to push forward democratic transition. And unchanged, again, is the background of Egyptian reality since the 1950s, since 1952, or to be more accurate, since 1954. The dominance of the military security complex in Egypt's political space, in the apparatus of the Egyptian state, which is highly centralized, in the executive branch of government, in different administrative bodies, has not been changed. And even worse, the very fact that that military security complex, which has always been removed from civilian oversight, be it coming from elected institutions, from a functioning and powerful parliament, or coming from civil society organizations, or from an independent press and independent media landscape demanding civilian oversight with regard to the military and security complex, the fact that the military security complex has always escaped civilian oversight continues to be a structuring reality in Egypt as of now. Unfortunately, enshrined in the Constitution of 2012, which was passed by the majority of the religious right-wing spectrum, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi Noor Party, and it's going to be even more enshrined and stipulated in the constitutional amendments which are being drafted as of now in an appointed assembly appointed by the military establishment, as far as I am concerned. The continued domination and dominance of the military security complex over Egyptian politics within the state, and Egyptians or experts on Egypt will know that we continue to have an overrepresentation of the military security complex, regardless where you look in the state apparatus and in different administrative bodies. You look at ministers, you look at governors, you look at municipalities, all the way. The state apparatus has been overly militarized since the 1950s, and it has never been changed. The fact that we lacked in the 2 years and a half between February 2011 and June 30th or July 3rd, June 30th, 2013, July 3rd, 2013, that we lacked incentives, we lacked attempts, political incentives and attempts in politics and outside of politics to bring the military and security complex under civilian oversight is a key factor explaining why, once again, that military security complex decided to interfere in Egyptian politics and basically to push us in a reverse direction as opposed to what we had in the last 2.5 years. To explain why it happened, one has to go in a more detailed manner into preferences of key political actors in Egypt. And some of you will not be surprised to hear that the religious right-wing spectrum, spearheaded by the Muslim Brotherhood and its party, Freedom and Justice, and by Salafi parties, did not demonstrate any political will to subject the military security complex to civilian oversight. Maybe they woke up quite late on July 3rd. But in the constitution which they controlled in 2012, they were willing to grant the army the status of a state over the state, not only within the state. They were willing to limit our legislative mandate as parliamentarians to legislate for the army. They granted the army a veto right on legislation coming from the People's Assembly. They granted the army no oversight with regard to its budget. The budget was to be included as one figure. Those are the details. Those are the mechanics of establishing a democratic transition. The army's budget was to be included as one figure in the state budget and not to be discussed in parliament, and so on and so forth. Civilians were to be put before military tribunals unchanged. So there was no political will on the side of the religious right-wing spectrum to really push forward civilian oversight and to redefine the place and the role of the military and security complex in Egyptian politics. Even worse, there was no political will. And of course, here I'm addressing the period between February 11, 2011 and July 3rd, 2013, in which the religious right-wing spectrum played a key role, the key role politically. I will get to liberal and leftist parties, especially to liberal parties as a liberal outcast as of now, in a detailed manner as well. not only that we did not see clear political will to redefine the army's position and the security services position in Egyptian politics and to emancipate the state and its apparatus from the overly dominant military security component, we also did not see any real political will to undertake one of the key tasks which any country transitioning to democracy has to undertake, and that is to reform the security apparatus. You look around, you go to Latin American countries, you look at Central and Eastern European countries, you look at the Balkans, you look at successful cases of democratic transition in African, Asian countries, and you realize that one of the key issues is to stop human rights violations. In order to stop human rights violations and impunity, one has to undertake the mission of reforming the security sector apparatus. And I can only attest to the fact, as a parliamentarian, between January 2012 and June 2012, we were dissolved in June 2012. I myself introduced in 6 different attempts pieces of draft legislation to subject the security services to a structural reform, and whatever I submitted, whatever I introduced, was voted down by the majority of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi Noor party. It's not amazing. It's not amazing at all, because what we are witnessing in Egypt is a reality of a democratic transition in the making that is being reversed because constituencies were not so eager to really get it in the democratic direction. And I guess 3 years on, almost 3 years on from February 11, 2011, what I can tell you right now with greater safety is that I know more about the impediments of democratic transition in Egypt. That's it. We haven't done much more. So we know more about the impediments, why it's not that easy. Why, and where, as far as Egypt is concerned, I would not share the statement made by my friend Haytham, Manna, on every Egyptian wishes democracy. No, they do not wish democracy, all of them. I mean, we're seeing a fascist current in the making, and people are running into it, happily. Some of them, at least. Okay, so far to the first factor, the dominance of the military and security complex and lack of political will to subject it to civilian oversight, to structurally redefine its place in Egyptian politics and in the state apparatus in a way which would enable democracy. And that has been a key failure. To an extent, liberal and leftist parties have to share responsibility for that as well, because they did not push in the limited resources they have been having in the last 2.5 years for a different democratic-based understanding of the army and security services, which have national tasks, which have to secure the country, have to grant safety to citizens, have to defend our national borders, but are not supposed to interfere in politics. Unfortunately, and therefore I'm a liberal outcast as of now, most liberal and leftist parties have supported the interference of the army in politics on July 3rd and before. And I was lucky enough to document my positions in writing in Al-Shuru and elsewhere, saying before June 30th, it's going to be a departure from democratic transitions. It's going to be a relapse to what we had before. It's going to be an end to democratic dynamics, at least for some time, which I continue to hope that it's going to be for some time. Second factor, and here I move beyond politics into a social and economic analysis, a snapshot as well. And to my mind, I was one of those who stated back in 2011 that, well, there are differences which have to be taken into consideration when we compare Tunisia, for example, to Egypt. Not only because the role of the army is different, historically speaking, in the two countries, and not only because there are key political differences to be kept in mind with regard to the party landscape which emerged in Egypt as opposed to Tunisia. No, it's also because the middle class in Egypt is quite different from what you see in Tunisia. Tunisia, I have to confess that I'm not following in great depth the details of political dynamics in Tunisia, but they seem to be still in a process of democratic transition, a difficult one, but it continues to go on. One of the key differences between Tunisia and Egypt is with regard to the middle class. The middle class in Egypt has been shrinking in the decades of the Mubarak rule, with one exception of the last 4 to 6 years in which economic growth was on the rise, around 6% on average was annually scored, but the middle class overall was shrinking in the decades of the Mubarak regime as opposed to the 1970s and as opposed to the 1950s and 1960s. And the shrinking middle class in Egypt was invaded in different ways since the first half of the 1970s by two currents, which are, to my mind, anti-democratic and have continued to be anti-democratic. The first current is, generally speaking, the Islamization current, the Islamization of state, society, and politics current, which invaded primarily since the first half of the 1970s the Egyptian middle class. And therefore, when you look at the ranks and files of the Muslim Brotherhood or of its party or of the Noor Salafi party, whom do you see? You see university professors, you see technical experts, you see representatives of the middle class. That middle class was invaded by an anti-democratic current in the first half of the 1970s, of course, partially politically promoted, motivated by Sadat. Some of you will know the details. But leaving that aside, that anti-democratic current continued to be dominant within the Egyptian middle class as well, pushing it away from a democratic perception based on pluralism, diversity, religious, Muslims and Copts, Baha'is, Shia, and so on and so forth, or to accept pluralism in Egyptian politics. And therefore, as the middle class was seeing the religious right-wing spectrum taking over based on electoral dynamics, Egyptian politics, they pushed that religious right-wing spectrum into more of radical positions with regard to recognizing pluralism, accepting and granting pluralism, and stipulating pluralism in the constitution. No one can ignore the fact that the constitution of 2012, which was, once again, the making of the Brotherhood and the Noor Salafi party, did not grant religious freedoms but to the followers of the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Whoever else was pushed aside. Did not stipulate equality between women and men. Was based on highly conservative, to my mind, reactionary perceptions of family, women, society, public space. You should go back and read it. As far as I'm concerned, it was a completely outdated document. Very reactionary perceptions of what societies should be aspiring to after a democratic revolution. But it was passed. And it was shouldered by the Egyptian middle class for some time. So it was the first current, and it continues to be dominant, by the way. Not less dominant is a second current, which I believe we have never been able to deconstruct in Egypt, and continues to take front seat position as far as the Egyptian middle class is concerned in urban and in rural areas. And that is a narrative related to the elusive dream of the 1950s and 1960s. The hero in uniform, a mighty establishment which will get it right, Abdel Nasser incarnation later on. And that is exactly what is being reactivated as of now. And I'm not addressing the personality issue. I'm not interested in it, or at least I'm trying to escape it while away from Egypt for a few days. But I'm more interested in the structure of the narrative related to that elusive dream. That is a highly anti-democratic narrative which is based on the supremacy of one key institution that is hierarchical, the army, as the supremacy of that one institution vis-a-vis society, vis-a-vis the state, its dominance over society and over the state, and it's based on a complete negation of the citizen as an individual with rights, with personal rights and freedoms. And therefore, what you will get out of the current Constituent Assembly, the appointed Constituent Assembly, is going to be a set of constitutional amendments which are by no means going to recognize the citizen as a key and cornerstone in Egyptian society and politics. How can we democratize without recognizing that we are not simply masses, we are not simply groups which can be asked to take out to the street to support A, B, C, or D, that we are citizens who have rights, and those rights have to be recognized and safeguarded. And it's our duty and mandate to hold the state accountable when it fails, to hold officials accountable when they fail. It is a complete, in German you would say Gleichschaltung, back to 1938. I love the concept because it really applies to what we are seeing. So citizen, ignore the fact that you exist in a group, you exist collectively, and that collective will have to be directed somewhere else. So it's equally an undemocratic narrative, which continues to be dominant in a middle class, within a middle class which has been shrinking, leaving vast spaces in society to impoverished sections of the population. Around 40 to 50% Egyptians live below the poverty line, and so what do you expect from them? And I'm not, once again, I would disagree on the centrality of elections to democratic transition. I see elections as key. But of course, the societal context we are looking at does enable party money, political motivated funding, the buying of votes, and so on and so forth, to deviate from what elections are supposed to offer in a country transitioning to democracy. But the second point is the socioeconomic picture, snapshot, which I'm offering, and the two anti-democratic narratives which continue to grasp attention and to dominate Egypt's public space. There is no way to understand the current debates in Egypt without taking into consideration the two anti-democratic narratives. And by the way, actors supporting the two narratives are not willing to do or to engage in any process of self-criticism. The anti-democratic narrative based on the elusive dream of the hero in uniform, the army will get it right, the military establishment, and so on and so forth, are reproducing what we had back in the 1950s and 1960s, and are even in a very harmful way romanticizing the 1950s and 60s from an Egyptian perspective. And the second anti-democratic narrative, the religious right-wing spectrum-based narrative, continues to see whatever they did in the last years as right, and that they are and have been cheated on what was legitimate gains from a democratic perspective. They do not see the fact that they did not account for what was needed in Egypt in terms of restructuring the position of the army in Egyptian politics and restructuring the apparatus, even gradually. And political scientists will know the term pacted transition. Whatever was done by the religious right-wing spectrum was based on a misguided perception of what a pacted transition could have been in Egypt, or it was a complete failure. Of course, related as well to the fact that that is a movement and a party in one, and that extremely ambivalent structure did not enable them to develop real capacity, and I saw it in parliament. I mean, it's a completely dysfunctional scene. The third factor, maybe I have to ask you how many minutes do I still have?
You have 3.
Well, fine. So, of course, I'm going to ignore what you've just said. No, I'll take it. I'll try to speed up. So I still have 3 factors which I'm going to outline briefly. Third factor, explaining why we are backsliding on democracy, is, and here, once again, we have to go and move beyond formal politics and actors in formal politics, parties, networks, and so on and so forth, and look at the wider public space and see which networks, which collective interests are present, are important, are significant, and whether they have a commitment to a process of democratic transition or not. And unfortunately, if you look at political parties, be it religious right-wing spectrum, and equally so, liberal and leftist parties, in different ways. By the way, when it comes to the army, the difference between the 2012 constitution and the current draft amendments which are being articulated is going to be in a negative direction. That is, not only will the army have a veto right over legislation, not only that the budget will not be discussed, will not be disclosed, not only that civilians will be still put before military tribunals, but the army will be granted a veto right with regard to the appointment of the Minister of Defense. So when it comes to political actors, commitment to a democratic transition has been half-hearted, if not highly ambivalent. And you cannot approach it from an ideological perspective, saying the good Democrats were liberals and leftists, and the bad Democrats were religious right wingers, or the other way around. But even more challenging for us in Egypt is the fact that key elites, financial, economic, as well as media elites, have been turning against democratic dynamics as well. And unfortunately, one has to take into consideration the reality of patrimonialism, which has been established in Egypt from a socioeconomic perspective, state-sponsored patrimonialism since the 1950s, and the fact that economic, financial, and media elites have always arranged themselves with the state and who rules the state, and they are not willing to get out of that pattern yet. otherwise you cannot understand who is funding what in Egypt. Otherwise you cannot understand why privately owned media is putting forward that pro-elusive dream, pro-military hero in uniform discourse and crushing other points of view and other opinions. As a liberal outcast, I was sidelined. Bassem Youssef has been sidelined. And we are only maybe 4 or 5 who continue to have a bit of space in the press, in the printed press, and maybe it's a matter of time. And that is not simply the making of the autocratic ruling establishment of the military security complex. Of course, I mean, we have a complete retreat to what they used to do before 2011. Once again, whatever I say, for example, whatever I say outside of Egypt, reports will be delivered on the same day and, of course, distorted. So I have to remind, in case we have journalists, please, if you're going to quote me, clear your quotes, send them to my email address ahead. My email address is simple. It's my first name, Amr, AMR, at my last name, Hamzawy.org. And so I'm grateful that you are taping it, and so you'll put it, hopefully do not edit whatever I said. Please, do not edit it. Put it as it is. So, good. Because I'm being forced to accept different imposed identities. So I am a sleeper. I am an Islamist sleeper. I am a member of the 5th column. So an extreme fascist borrowing from the Spanish Civil War. Some will know. But anyhow, so that is commitment of elites to democracy. 4th factor is, and once again we cannot get around it, and I in my modest capacities try to push for a new approach with regard to that issue in the last years, but I have to recognize my failure. The Egyptian state has a highly centralized structure. And political scientists will know that it's very difficult to democratize centralized state structures in conditions in which the state historically has always been more powerful than societal dynamics and networks within society, political actors, civil actors, and so on and so forth. In such a centralized state, it's very difficult to zero in on entry points, to zero in on points to push forward democratization incentives. It's a centralized state which has always controlled the distribution of resources for society to different output, to different results, with different degrees of acceptance or refusal within society, but it has always dominated the process of redistribution and redistribution of resources. And in such a centralized state structure, the incentives for democratization can always come in a very difficult manner, and if they come, they have to be related to 2 key institutions. One is the judicial branch of government. You have to have an independent judicial branch of government which puts forward a clear perception of what a rule of law is. And so different deficits have to be noted in that regard. The second institution is the powerful legislative branch of government. Once again, to make a powerful legislative branch of government out of what we have been having in Egypt since the 1950s, because we have always had parliaments, Majlis Ummah in Arabic, later on Majlis Sha'b, and so on and so forth, but they have always been structurally weak. And they have always submitted to a second dangerous weakness, which is a weakness of elected officials as opposed to appointed officials. I mean, if you look at Egypt, even at the constitution and the legal framework, it favors appointed officials as opposed to elected officials. And so with a weak parliament and a judicial branch of government where a clear-cut perception of what a rule of law is not moving forward in a speed which would convince society to democratize, convince the state gradually to accept incentives for democratization, the centralization of the state structure becomes a burden which we are witnessing as of now, and we really have to address it. Unfortunately, that is one of the debates which were not dealt with in a serious manner. Finally, and moving to what Professor Norton said at the beginning. So in Egypt, what happened was on June 25th, 2011, Egyptians claimed the public space, claimed it, claimed the street in a very, I mean, the physical meaning of what a public space is. I mean, leave aside debates, leave aside media, leave aside the non-physical layers of the public space. Egyptians claimed the public space, claimed the street. And since then, since February 11, 2011, from a legal perspective, from a constitutional perspective, from a political perspective, and from an economic perspective, elites, key political actors have been conspiring to evacuate Egyptians from the public space. And so the title of my, because Mr. Chair mentioned my article for Shuru, title of my tomorrow's article is the evacuation of Egyptians out of the public space. That is exactly what's happening. With legal tools, with constitutional tools, and with the elements of the security services which are once again subjecting Egyptians in a targeted manner to surveillance or to torture and so on and so forth, or political elites which have conspired to evacuate Egyptians out of the public space again. But, and here I come to my last sentence, but because Egyptians' wide constituencies which took out to the street on June 25th, or on January 25th, or on June 2011, or on June 30th, 2013, because wide constituencies have lost hope in the promise of democracy, and democracy for a democratic transition to function, to continue to convince, the hope of democracy, the promise of democracy, which is personal prosperity and a gradually becoming more clear present and future conditions, that promise of democracy was not delivered on. In a way, we betrayed popular hopes. Egyptians, many of them are not willing to speak positively about democracy as of now. Why? Because what they have been seeing is a deterioration of their living conditions. Promises were not delivered on with regard to improving their living conditions or injecting more of social justice in a society with 50% people living under the poverty line, and so on and so forth. And therefore, Egyptians are accepting, ironically, many of them are accepting their evacuation from the public space. Thank you very much. You need me to sit down or stand up?
No, I think you can take the questions from there. And I appreciate the fact that there is much more to say, and I'm sorry to limit the time. I realize that most professors are used to 1 hour deliveries, and 20 minutes become too short.
You mean social scientists, right? Not nuclear and mechanical engineers?
But we need to move on, unfortunately, and we will take a couple of questions, but please try to limit
I'm happy to do a Q&A at the end of the session, so in order not to discriminate against the last speaker.
Okay, well, we can do that too. All right, thank you. Our last speaker is Dr. Melani Cammett. She is from the faraway state of Rhode Island as Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown University. She's spending, I understand, a period of time at the Harvard School of Public Health, following up on some aspects of her expertise, which is in the political economy of development, particularly of the Middle East. She published her first book titled Globalization and Business Politics in North Africa in 2007. It was published by Cambridge University Press, focused on Morocco and Tunisia. She has 2 books in the making at the moment. One is Compassionate Communalism, Welfare and Sectarianism in Lebanon, which is coming out from Cornell University Press next year. And she's also pursuing another book on global aspects of business. And in that connection, her research at Harvard Public Health School is going on. She joined us today in order to address the question of political economy of the Arab uprising.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. and I will speak a little bit about the political economy context of the uprisings, and then make some comments about how this affects sort of challenges that the Arab countries are facing right now. And I should mention that some of what I'm going to say draws on ongoing work with Ishaq Diwan, who's at the Kennedy School right now. And what we've been looking at in a recent publication, and then something we're working on coming out next year, is on the political economy aspects that motivated the uprisings, the Arab Spring, and so to look at the common resonance of the uprisings across some, but not all countries in the Arab world, related to the rising perception of inequality and inequalities of opportunities. So just to quickly summarize the argument, we've argued that narrowing authoritarian coalitions in the context of crony capitalism, combined with the rollback of the state and declining welfare regimes in the region, alienated formal sector workers and especially the tenuous middle class that Amr just talked about, and this contributed to growing perceptions of unequal life chances, and not just perceptions, but realities of inequalities of opportunity that collectively constitute an important backdrop to the uprisings, certainly in Tunisia and Egypt, but across many other countries as well. And I should emphasize that we are trying to explain variation in the work, why it is that some places have uprisings that were more extensive and protracted and so forth. And there is some variation in the political economy context of countries across the region that helps to explain patterns of diffusion and non-diffusion. And so what we see is contingent on country-specific political economies, but it's not simply an economic argument because it's grounded in shifting the political context of economic change, changing interests of members of authoritarian coalitions and so forth. Now, explaining uprisings cannot be reduced to one or even a couple of factors. These are very complex phenomena, and different frameworks will emphasize different aspects of uprisings. So some people will emphasize contingency and human agency and so forth. And certainly these are important factors. You cannot understand why people took to the streets without leadership, without agency, without contingent events and so forth. But what I'd like to highlight are the structural factors that opened up windows of opportunities. And then emphasize this shared context of perceived rising inequalities. So when we look at variation across the region in the uprisings, I think it's well known to all of us here which countries had more extensive uprisings and so forth. And there is a huge amount of political science literature coming out now. I find myself getting a request to review another manuscript like every month on the uprisings. And you know, I think there's a lot of consensus, I'm a political scientist, among many political scientists, that it isn't political regime type per se that explains why you have uprisings in some places more than others. So in the beginning, some people are saying, well, the monarchies seem more immune to the uprisings than the authoritarian republics. But I think a lot of people have pointed out, rightfully so, in my opinion, that it's not so much related to the fact of monarchy, but it's about how monarchies in the region have exercised power, have dispersed power, have allowed pockets of expression and so forth, and have exercised different patterns of patronage politics. And in some countries that are, you know, called sort of quasi-democracies like Lebanon or Iraq or Palestine, I think the issue has nothing really to do with democracy, which we know is quite flawed. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Lebanon, and it's difficult to say that this is a democracy of high quality. But the fact of the matter is power is very dispersed in these places. So I think that has a lot to do with why uprisings have not gained as much traction. But apart from those issues, there is a shared economic context. And some of Amr's remarks touched on this, that since independence in roughly the 1950s through the early 1980s across the region, whether you were in a populist republic or a so-called conservative monarchy, there was a lot of state spending and a lot of guarantee for social provision, including public provision of health care, schooling, and so forth, which were new developments after independence. And then what we saw was a rollback of the state. Now, of course, oil is an obvious major point of differentiation, because if you have a lot of per capita oil wealth, you can afford to sustain this kind of spending. And so it's no accident that we see less articulated uprisings in many of the oil wealthy countries. Obviously, oil is not determinative. Just look at Kuwait, and you can see that there are different patterns of politics and so forth, with more political opening in some places like Kuwait than others. But oil is an obvious factor. And so I think in this context, even in these non-oil rich countries where you had, after independence, a rollout of public provision, at least benefiting part of society, you had real social mobility in the first decades of independence, and arguably the creation of citizen expectations for material advancement and well-being that were not fulfilled in the 1980s onward. So again, this is not an argument about pure economic indicators, because actually economic indicators don't help us in explaining the uprisings. You had a relatively stable macroeconomic situation in the countries like Egypt and Tunisia, where the revolution started. Their international reserves were at pretty comfortable levels. You had high unemployment rates, especially youth unemployment, as we all know, but this is not a new story. So you can't say this was at the core of things. And relative to other regions of the world, like Latin America in particular, the Middle East, the Arab world, is not characterized by terribly high levels of income inequality. And subsidies at that point were not being cut. So there's a lot of interesting puzzles here. If it's only about economic indicators, why did these uprisings happen in late 2010, early 2011? Why did they start in Tunisia and Egypt, where you actually had pretty good growth rates in the preceding decade? Why did they occur at the end of 2010 when there were no apparent direct triggers, such as cuts in subsidies or shifts in foreign alliances and that sort of thing? And why not earlier in the 1990s when you saw, and 80s even, when you saw the decline in state spending? So, there's a lot of sort of interesting puzzles there, and that we need to explore. So let me just say a little bit more about this argument, about the framework that we've been using, starting with the narrowing of authoritarian coalitions. So basically, I think it's well known now that through beginning in the 1980s onward, you saw a real narrowing across many countries of their main social coalitions, this increasing concentration among business elites with close ties to the state, and this was leading to an increasingly unequal playing field. And this was playing out, of course, in the context of fiscal crisis and the adoption of market-oriented reforms, whereby states could not sustain the kinds of commitments that they had made in previous decades. And so you had this emergence of a very well-connected elite, which profited from special access to economic opportunities. And this is not lost on the eyes of citizens in these countries, coupled with the state rollback. If you look at data on government consumption, government spending as a percentage of GDP in the Middle East, in the Arab region, it far outstrips any other region. And so what you saw was in the 1970s, it shot up really high, especially on the back of oil price shocks or price spikes, but fell really precipitously in the 1980s. To a very low figure by international standards, and you did not see a commensurate rise in private investment. Then the reforms that were adopted tended to hurt the poor and middle classes. And this really matters. I think this focus on the middle class really matters a lot, because this was the core constituency of a lot of regimes, certainly in the case of Egypt, the sort of newly created state middle classes, state bourgeoisie, so to speak, was very important. but across many countries in the region as well. And with state rollback, you saw not only cuts to agricultural subsidies and so forth that were painful to the rural poor, but cuts in, lower public sector wages and hiring freezes. And, when you look at welfare regimes in Arab countries, the core of the welfare regime, to the extent that there is a welfare state at all, was public employment. So this is particularly painful in this context. And then what we also saw was the de facto decline of health and education systems. So spending rates didn't necessarily change, but we know that, spending rates don't necessarily tell us that much about what people actually experience in schools and clinics and so forth. And so, in the case of Egypt, and this is not confined to Egypt by any stretch of the imagination, you still have on the books public guaranteed a right to health care and a public health care system and clinics and public hospitals and so forth. But these are effectively hollowed out and gutted. Doctors might not show up in the public clinics. They might show up and tell you to go to their private clinic in the afternoon. They might not have the medicine or equipment and so forth. So a real hollowing out of this public welfare system that was so important, not just to the poor, but to middle classes as well. And when you look at the backdrop of social mobility and social indicators in the region, this is an enormous change. Just to throw out one statistic, over a 45-year period starting in about 1960, the Arab states maintained the highest annualized rate of infant mortality reductions in the world. So many times faster than in sub-Saharan Africa. You see improvements, also other regions in the world. And so there were real tangible achievements. You can see it in these kinds of indicators and literacy rates and so forth. So arguably this creates aspirations, expectations for social mobility. And these formal sector workers, and especially civil servants, were hit pretty hard. And again, they were the core of regimes' sort of mass social base, not the elite social base, but mass social base. We've heard a lot about the problem of subsidies, and this is a real political issue, of course, cutting subsidies, because a lot of people are dependent on subsidies. And this has been something that has been very difficult, if not impossible, for governments across the region to cut. The problem is that the rising subsidy component of government budgets has actually further exacerbated the system because there's less money to invest in public welfare. So turning to cronyism and the sort of increasing narrowing of elite social coalitions, there's no need to spell out this story. I know we're all familiar with it. But there is evidence from public opinion data that this really mattered a lot in people's thinking. For example, there was a Pew survey done in 2010 that noted that corruption was the top concern of Egyptians, with almost 50% of people listing it as their number one concern about their country, ahead of the lack of democracy, ahead of poor economic conditions. And we know now that this was not just about perceptions, that there actually was crony capitalism going on. We see this in trials and so forth. And so this cronyism had contributed arguably in two ways. One is it was an important factor, I think research is increasingly showing, behind economic underperformance in the region. There are some studies that have come out that have showed that firms that were well connected had disproportionately large access to credit, but didn't necessarily perform well. In fact, were less productive than firms that were less politically connected. So that has a negative effect on growth. And secondly, going back to perceptions, the narrowing of these authoritarian coalitions really fueled perceptions of inequality. And so perceived inequality, I think, again, is an important factor. But it's also real, and this brings me back to the welfare, the erosion of welfare regimes, because there's rising inequality of opportunity. And there's a whole bunch of research coming out, especially by Arab economists now, on inequality of opportunity that's measuring inequality of opportunity with respect to the health and education systems, showing that these systems have declined and are basically obviating the possibility of social mobility. Again, this declining public sector employment with these declining welfare conditions is disastrous from a political perspective. I just want to make a few comments about sort of bringing this back to our current situation. Actually, let me just say a few things about some survey data to emphasize that this is not just a bunch of academics sitting here in Providence, Rhode Island, or Boston, or Cambridge dreaming up this stuff. I mean, I think we all know that this resonates, but also there is public opinion data that supports this. There was a 2005 poll done across the Arab world that showed that expanding employment opportunities, improving the healthcare system, and improving education and ending corruption were the most important priorities. Again, outflanking democracy and sort of political rights in terms of citizen priorities in their country. Similarly, a 2010 survey, the Arab Youth Survey, showed that the greatest perceived challenge and concern was the cost of living and then unemployment, followed later by human rights. And when you look at the changes in responses from the previous year in 2009 to 2010, the number one increase in the concern of the surveyed population was this increased perception of inequality of incomes, so income inequality. So clearly this is a central concern among real people in the region. And I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done, but also I think there's policy implications for the current political moment. So research-wise, I think there's some interesting work to be done. I'm starting some work on this with a colleague in Beirut on the impact of prior decades of welfare legacies on citizen expectations of their state. Do we see variation across different countries or intergenerational variation of what citizens expect of their governments and so forth? What about subnational variation? We know very clearly now, we knew it before, but now we really know it, that there are spatial inequalities in the Arab countries. I mean, just look at where the revolution began in central Tunisia and so forth. So do we see spatial variation in how people relate to their states and what they expect of their states? And I think there's a really important need to link public opinion research with these macro trends to see how people perceive inequalities and how this shapes their political behavior. Now, I think, on a policy agenda, we really need to take more seriously welfare regime reform. Easier said than done, and of course, political challenges are monopolizing the headlines for good reason, because these challenges are particularly vexing and are either leading to backsliding or just stalemate, depending on the context, the country that you're in. In Tunisia, we keep thinking there's going to be a breakthrough, but then there's another obstacle in the national dialogue and so forth. A very different situation, I agree, than Egypt, but still one filled with challenges. So clearly welfare regime reform is at the top of the policy agenda. It should be at the top of the policy agenda. It's something that really motivated people to get out on the streets at enormous risks to themselves. And when we look across the world today, there is a real trend among governments to pursue universal coverage of their populations in health systems. So this is a big sort of priority of policymakers across the world. And it's definitely something that's being discussed in the ministries of health in Arab countries as well. And you don't need a lot of money to do that. I mean, just look at the case of Costa Rica. There are ways to configure and allocate resources and so forth, emphasizing cheaper preventative care and primary care that can actually provide significant improvements in people's lives in the health sector. But, and this brings it back to politics, you can't make these policy changes without overcoming political obstacles. So on the one hand, I think we need to, collectively as scholars and policymakers and activists really focus a lot on these material things that affect people's lives, because these revolutions have been going on for several years now, and there's been no tangible improvement in ordinary people's lives, and in some cases, a decline. So this is really where the policy focus should be. But when you talk to public health specialists who don't have a background in political science, sometimes the discussion can be very technical about, how do you arrange financing arrangements or delivery systems and so forth. The fact of the matter is, and increasingly public health specialists and others recognize this, it all boils down to politics. So you can't actually make any improvements in people's lives until you overcome the political stalemate. So that's, in addition to obstacles to real constitutional reform or, coming up with a real roadmap to elections in Tunisia and constitutional reform, you can't actually go ahead and make these major tangible changes and bring about more inclusive social policy regimes without political consensus. So that's where the politics hits the sort of social policy and really, creates, I think, in my view, a tragedy. So just to conclude, I want to say that to make these kinds of major policy changes, to bring about more inclusive social policy regimes, you need a shift, a real meaningful shift in what some people call political settlements. Political settlements are different from formal regime type. It's not democracy, authoritarianism, monarchy, and so forth. They're the informal rules of the game that shape which groups and organizations have access to power, are involved in the distribution of resources. And I think some of Amar's comments are related here about the fact that you don't actually see a real shift in the political settlement in Egypt, because the military is still the dominant actor, and you still see business elites that became quite entrenched with significant influence. The situation is different in other countries. I think the situation is quite different in Tunisia. Yes, there's a major stalemate going on, but you do have these very well institutionalized civil society actors like the UGTT, the labor union, or Utica, the producers organization, and others, human rights groups and so forth, that are actually trying to craft some kind of consensus. Whether and when and how they're going to succeed is another issue, but there is an ongoing process here that's not completely 100% broken down. And so you do actually see something of a shift in the core political settlement in Tunisia. So it may be there that it's more possible once a political consensus is reached, that you can actually have some kind of meaningful change in the socioeconomic system there. Thank you.
So now we have a few minutes for a few questions. Let's start there.
So my question is for Dr. Hamzawy. I found your discussion really interesting, and I just wanted to posit a theory and hear your comments on it. It seems to me that, in part, the downfall of the democratic vision in Egypt stems from the disorganization of the mass movements for democracy. The theory of the romanticized memory of Abdel Nasser being part of what made that idea of then calling the military in to overthrow Morsi really plays into this, as people will often be swayed by an idea which pervades the popular consciousness. I've heard some analysis of the Muslim Brotherhood that the reason for their success in the elections was because of their grassroots work, developing social services and really building a loyal base and a loyal following. And similarly, that the reason the left didn't win was because they didn't really have that unified front and that similar base. And so my question is, isn't there something to be learned from this? You're talking about centralized government, so perhaps a decentralized attempt, which actually takes more time, but a process of building power at the grassroots level would offer a meaningful way to push for democracy, not to mention economic equality.
Thank you.
I have one last question,
we need to really move on.
I know, but my other question is just, I would like him to defend.
I do appreciate it, but we do need to move. Dr. Hamzawy, would you care to respond?
You used the word liberal many times, and I just want to know what you mean by liberal also. Thank you.
We can, in order to grant attendees more time, maybe we can collect questions, and I can respond to questions later on. So it doesn't have to be one-on-one, which would take more time. if you like.
Well, I think we're not set up for this, so
Okay.
I suggest we move on. But could you respond briefly, please, so that we can undertake other questions?
I gave you a practical suggestion, so. Okay. Well, no, I definitely see your point on the issue of lack of organization of mass movements. In fact, if you take that concept out of social arena and inject it in the political arena, it becomes lacking constituency building activities, systematic constituency building activities, which has been one of, at the macro level, one of the major impediments for liberal and leftist parties, liberal and leftist movements in Egypt throughout the last years and decades, in fact. So yes, definitely there is a lesson to be learned with regard to how to reach out to organized constituencies, how to influence the way organized constituencies in urban and rural areas, socioeconomic constituencies, perceive politics, perceive what they expect from politicians. I ran in the elections of 2011, and one of the major issues which I was facing was popular expectations with regard to what parliamentarians are supposed to do. Are you a service parliamentarian in your district with regard to your geographical constituencies, or do you legislate for the country as well? And then a great part of what was shared by you on the closing of social alliances, sustaining regimes, and how can opposition movements benefit from it, because we have failed greatly to offer an alternative view as well with regard to, be it in the People's Assembly in the case of Egypt, or before or after. There were some brief discussions on healthcare coverage and so on and so forth, trying to emancipate citizens from the perception of it will always come from the state, it will always come from the military. And there were very great ideas which were put forward, but we could not deliver on them. Ironically enough, now the army is doing part of what you were just describing with regard to healthcare coverage, and so it's different dynamics. But yes, on the religious right-wing spectrum and their grassroots, I believe it really warrants a re-examination, because part of what we have been saying with regard to their social capital and based on proximity to the people, now we are at least facing a puzzle in Egypt, which is fine. So if it was the case, and I used to write the same, exactly, their social capital and can be translated to political capital. So what happened to that social capital? It warrants a discussion, because I mean, forget about whoever would like to join the winning side, but if they have been working that hard on the grassroots level, if they have been working that hard to build a social capital, and they could build it, where did it go? Where is that social capital as of now? Why isn't it stopping people from rejecting in a massive way the very existence of the movement or its party? Branches were attacked, burned down, and different symptoms which we really have to recognize. And my brief explanation is, maybe it was sort of a social capital based on the very structure of the patrimonial state which exists, was a mirror image of the state. And in a way, citizens discovered that, well, they would get a better deal by sticking to the state at the end of the day, that it's not a sort of a regular, sustainable delivery which they get from the Brotherhood, because they did not deliver on most of what they promised in the year. So it warrants a discussion with regard to the social capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Amr. Yes.
This is for Professor Cammett. When you began, you said you wanted to look at what were the causes of the beginning in 2011. Why did this happen this time? And so there must have been something different. And I wondered, I remember reading reports from the World Bank and IMF about the effect of the crash in 2008 and the droughts in 2010 and the price of food. And that Egypt in particular is sensitive to the world price of food, because Egypt is food dependent. And it doesn't deal with the issue of its lack of water. It cannot grow enough food given the amount of water it has to feed its population. And so it's dependent on importing virtual water in the form of grain from the US and Canada and Argentina, and that involves borrowing money from the World Bank and the IMF. And from 2008, the IMF and the World Bank were saying that there's going to be revolutions, there's going to be worldwide disturbances because of global climate change, because of the financial crisis. And so I think that that's an important factor, and I wonder if you give that any consideration.
I'll just brief. I didn't want to take too much time, but actually one of the things I was going to say is that the one economic indicator that does seem to stand out there is the food price spike. I don't think the global financial crisis so much is as immediate as that, because first of all, the region is less integrated in the global economy. I mean, the fact that demand from Europe slowed down matters for sure, especially for the North African countries, which have manufacturing export sectors that are linked into European markets. But I think the food price thing is one economic indicator that actually does matter quite a bit for precisely the reasons you say, that Egypt is so food dependent and so forth. So and that's something that obviously hits people immediately. And I absolutely agree with the point that you made or implied about the fact that this wasn't totally unforeseen, because a lot of people, economists, political scientists, social scientists, especially people who work on political economy, not so much, there's a huge literature in political science on persistent authoritarianism. So if you're studying persistent authoritarianism, it's not surprising that you don't look for regime change, because you're looking at the factors that enable regimes to persist. But there were a lot of folks working on more political economy issues who had been highlighting these kinds of factors and others for a really long time. Now, I think it's unfair to expect anyone, policymaker, social scientist, whoever you might be, to pinpoint, a revolution is coming, because precisely there is so much contingency and agency involved in these kinds of complex mobilizations. But certainly the political economy background was foreseen, as you pointed out.
Okay, I'm afraid we have run out of time, and we took 5 minutes out of the break. So let's conclude by thanking our speakers for very, very interesting talks.